The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1:5. In a world drowning in noise, confusion, and masks, there comes a moment when truth demands to be heard. And today, that moment is now. If you've felt the weight of silence, of being misunderstood, of watching injustice march forward while good people look away, this story is for you. This isn't just a tale, it's a confrontation. It's the collision of truth and denial, light and shadow, voice and void. So before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this need guardians, witnesses, and warriors like you. Turn on the notifications, because every chapter that follows might just shift something deep inside you. This isn't just content, it's a mission. The silence in that room wasn't empty. It was swollen, thick, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs like rising water. Eyes darted around, pretending not to see what had become too obvious to ignore. But one man, he didn't look away. He couldn't, because some truths, once seen, have a way of haunting the soul until they are spoken aloud. The cost of silence was no longer acceptable, and in that moment, standing between loyalty and conscience, he chose to shatter the illusion. He remembered the first time he saw the signs. Not glaring red alarms, no, something far more insidious. Smiles that didn't meet the eyes, laughter that ended too fast, documents that vanished, promises that sounded too perfect. At first, he gave the benefit of the doubt, told himself, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's nothing. But deep down, he knew. The gut doesn't whisper lies, it warns. Every step deeper into the organization revealed cracks, and behind each crack, a shadow. Meetings behind closed doors, phone calls that stopped when he walked in, and those glances, half fear, half complicity. He wasn't paranoid, he was awake in a system that begged him to stay asleep. But how do you ignore the scream of your own conscience when it's louder than applause? He started writing it all down, every irregularity, every inconsistency. He was building a case, but more than that, he was building courage. What made it harder was that they weren't monsters. They were friends, mentors, people who once held him when he broke down. The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. How do you turn against people you once loved, respected? He struggled with the weight of being both witness and whistleblower, and that tension between heart and truth nearly tore him apart. But in darkness, conviction becomes a torch. He stopped sleeping, not from fear, but from fire, the kind that burns when purpose overrides comfort. He knew what would happen if he spoke: retaliation, isolation, maybe even danger. But something in him had already shifted. The decision wasn't if, it was when. And so he rehearsed the words, not to memorize them, but to survive them. Because truth spoken out loud isn't just information, it's war. He found one ally. Just one. A woman in the archives who had been watching from the shadows. She whispered, "You're not crazy. I've seen it too." That sentence saved him, because revolutions often begin with two people, one willing to speak and one willing to believe. Together, they began to trace the roots of the deception. Not just what was done, but why. The patterns, the motivations, the lies that fed the system like veins feeding a heart. By the time the moment came to step forward, he was ready, not because he was fearless, but because he finally understood the price of staying silent. He stood before that board, voice trembling but clear, and he told the story. Not just his, but all the ones no one dared speak. And when he finished, the room didn't erupt. It didn't collapse. It breathed. For the first time in years, it breathed truth. The aftermath wasn't quiet. Whispers started curling through the hallways like smoke from a fire someone swore didn't exist. People who had once greeted him with warm familiarity now looked away. Some out of fear, others out of guilt. But the truth, once spoken, had a weight all its own. It shifted the air, unsettled the dust. The institution tried to contain it, package it, reduce it to a misunderstanding. But seeds had been planted, and truth, unlike lies, grows without permission. He watched as policies were reworded overnight, records mysteriously corrected, stories rewritten in real time. Damage control, they called it. But he knew better. They weren't fixing what was broken. They were painting over rot. The problem wasn't cosmetic. It was systemic. And pretending otherwise only made the rot bolder. That's when he realized. Exposing the truth wasn't enough. He had to defend it. Protect it from being buried again. Sleep came in broken fragments. Every silence felt loaded. Every email, a potential threat. But even as fear crept in, so did resolve. He started documenting everything. Calls, meetings, strange encounters. Not out of paranoia, but preservation. Because whistleblowers don't just fight systems, they fight amnesia. They fight the slow, strategic forgetting that happens when power is challenged. And he refused to be erased. People began approaching him in secret. "Thank you," they whispered. "I thought I was alone." They came with stories, with evidence, with shattered trust. And every story validated the one he told. It wasn't just a single act of wrongdoing. It was a culture. A pattern that repeated in different offices, different names, same tactics. What he had started was no longer just his. It had become a movement in the shadows. Still, the loneliness was profound. Publicly, he was painted as bitter, unstable, insubordinate. They questioned his character because they couldn't disprove his facts. He learned that truth-tellers are often crucified before they're vindicated. And yet, he didn't break, because he had made peace with being misunderstood. When your cause is clarity, you can't let confusion own your narrative. He stood firm, not because he felt brave, but because retreating would betray too much. The woman in the archives, his only visible ally, was fired under the guise of restructuring. He saw the game for what it was, retaliation dressed as reform. That loss hit him hard. She was the one person who had said, "I see you." Now he had to become that voice for others, not out of ego, but necessity. When you're the only one left standing, you either become the bridge or the warning sign. He chose the former. One day, he walked past a conference room and caught sight of a slide presentation, one that used his exact findings, rebranded as internal discoveries. No credit, no mention, just sanitized truths repackaged by the same people who once denied them. That moment hurt more than any accusation. They had stolen his voice and weaponized it for their own image. And yet, he smiled, because even stolen truth is still truth. And deep down, he knew. Once released, truth cannot be caged again. He started speaking at gatherings, small at first, cautious, anonymous forums, encrypted meetings, underground circles of people who had been burned by institutions they once believed in. His story resonated, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. He spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor, a storyteller with a scarred compass, pointing others toward north. Every time he shared, he felt the tension in the room shift. Eyes widened, mouths pressed tight. People leaned forward, not out of curiosity but recognition. He wasn't just exposing corruption, he was reflecting back their silence. And that's what scared them most. That their own voices had long been buried under professionalism, decorum, fear. But here he was, bleeding truth with no shame. And it gave them permission to do the same. The letters started coming, printed, handwritten, anonymous. Some were threats, others, gratitude. Most were a mix of both. "I admire what you did, but I can't risk everything. Thank you for speaking. I wish I was brave enough. You've ruined a legacy." These words lingered longer than he expected. Not because they hurt, but because they revealed the war happening inside people's hearts. The tug between conscience and comfort. He wasn't chasing revenge, he was chasing repair. But systems don't like to be repaired. They like to be worshipped or left alone. The more he spoke, the more pushback came. Not with bullets or lawsuits, but with silence, demotions, and bureaucratic exile. They didn't kill his voice. They tried to mute it with indifference. But what they forgot is that truth echoes, especially in empty rooms. One night after a particularly raw interview, he sat alone on a rooftop, city lights blinking below him like scattered truths. He thought about quitting, about disappearing, starting over. But then he remembered a phrase she once told him. "Your voice is a lighthouse. Some will curse it. Others will survive because of it." He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and whispered, "I'm not done yet." Purpose is a stubborn thing. It doesn't die easy. He knew he was being watched. His phone battery drained too fast. Strange cars lingered outside his building. Friends warned him to stop pushing. But fear had long since become familiar. It sat in his chest like an old friend, no longer paralyzing, just present. And so he kept writing, kept speaking, not for glory, not even for justice, but because the alternative, silence, was a slow kind of death. One woman wrote, "Because of you, I spoke up too." And that one sentence carried more weight than every headline, every threat, every sleepless night. That's when he realized he had become the very thing he once sought. Not a whistleblower, not a rebel, but a mirror. A voice that reflected others back to themselves. A signal flare in a storm too many thought they had to endure alone. The moment came when he was invited to speak on a national platform. It wasn't a trap, but it wasn't safe either. He knew the rules had changed. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about leading. Every word would be dissected, every breath analyzed. But he didn't flinch. He walked onto that stage like a man who had already lost everything and somehow found something even greater. The silence before his first sentence was the kind that demands reverence. He looked into the camera, not at the audience, and said, "I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to remind you of what you already know." The room was sterile, corporate, sanitized, but his voice cracked with something raw, something real. He didn't offer bullet points or policy suggestions. He offered a heart laid bare. He spoke of betrayal, not just by others, but by the self when we choose comfort over courage. He spoke of complicity, of how we all play a part in the stories we pretend not to see. And for a moment, the walls felt thinner, as if the structure itself was listening, unsure of how to defend against something so human. After the broadcast, he received praise from strangers and silence from those closest to him. Familiar faces stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. Some feared being associated with him. Others simply didn't know how to stand beside someone who had chosen truth over tribe. But he didn't mourn the distance. He understood that speaking light into darkness means you'll lose people who've built their homes in the shadows. And though it hurt, he also knew, not everyone is meant to follow where you go. He began documenting stories from others, nurses, teachers, officers, artists, all carrying burdens they were told to ignore. They sent him photos, audio, journal entries. He didn't publish them, not yet. He listened, cataloged, affirmed, because sometimes healing starts not with action, but acknowledgement. He was becoming a vessel, not just for outrage, but for memory, for dignity, for the invisible threads that hold us together long after institutions fail us. Then came the backlash. Real, public, undeniable. A smear campaign surfaced. His private life exposed, his integrity questioned, old wounds twisted into weapons. It wasn't surprising, but it was exhausting. He remembered thinking, they don't even care if it's true. They just want people to doubt. And doubt, he knew, is corrosive. It doesn't destroy all at once. It erodes. So he anchored himself again, not in proving them wrong, but in remembering why he started. Support came in waves, not always loud. Sometimes it was just a glance from someone in the crowd, a nod, a message that read, "Keep going." And sometimes that was enough. He learned that movements aren't always thunder. Sometimes they're whispers that refuse to be silenced. And his voice, cracked and weary as it was, had become one of those whispers. A constant reminder that even in a world built to forget, some truths refuse to die. On the one-year anniversary of his first public statement, he walked alone to the place it all began. The same hallway, the same smell of stale coffee and ambition. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. He stood there, breathing in the weight of it all, not in regret, but in reverence, for the cost, for the calling, for the countless unnamed voices that had carried him here. He whispered a quiet promise to the walls, "I won't stop. I can't." His work evolved into something quieter, more deliberate. He didn't seek attention. He sought accuracy, precision. He trained others in documentation, in resilience, in how to recognize the patterns of suppression before they become policy. He created a blueprint, not for rebellion, but for resistance with roots, not for noise, but for change that outlasts applause. And the people who followed weren't just angry, they were awake. A young man approached him after one workshop. Shaky hands, nervous eyes. He said, "I thought I was broken, but you made me realize I was just surrounded by liars." That sentence stuck to his ribs, because healing, he realized, isn't about going back to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone who can carry both pain and purpose and not confuse the two. He wasn't healing alone, he was helping others do it too. There were still nights when he questioned everything, when the price felt too steep, the silence too loud. But in those moments, he didn't run. He wrote. He poured his doubts into pages, not to give them power, but to see them clearly, to trace their shape and name them. Because unspoken doubt becomes poison. Spoken, it becomes a map. And maps, even messy ones, help us find our way back to conviction. One letter arrived that shook him. It wasn't praise or threat. It was confession. From someone on the inside. Someone who had tried to bury the truth he exposed. They wrote, "I see now what I was part of. I don't ask for forgiveness. Just don't stop." That letter made him cry. Not out of triumph, out of grief. Because even the villains in this story were once human. And somewhere along the way they traded integrity for survival, just like he almost did. He began to see it clearly. This wasn't just about one institution. This was a mirror of something larger. A culture that rewards silence, punishes curiosity, and dresses loyalty as virtue. He wasn't just fighting corruption. He was fighting apathy. The slow decay of moral responsibility that happens when good people decide to stay comfortable instead of conscious. And that war, he knew, was far from over. But there was light too. Real, tangible light. A school changed its reporting protocol because of his work. A city council passed a Whistleblower Protection Act inspired by his testimony. Not massive victories, not overnight change, but seeds. Seeds with roots. And every time he saw one sprout, he felt something holy. Not religious, but sacred. Like maybe this fight wasn't just about justice, maybe it was about redemption. He stood on another stage, years later now. Older, quieter, wiser. The room held new faces, new fighters, people who carried their own stories of rupture and resolve. He didn't speak like he used to. There was no fire, no fury, just clarity, calm. He said, "Courage isn't loud, it's consistent." And in that sentence lived a lifetime of storms, scars, and stubborn hope. They didn't clap right away. They just breathed. As if, finally, someone had named what they'd been trying to feel. The landscape had shifted. Not entirely, not perfectly, but enough to notice. People began speaking sooner, hesitating less. Organizations paused before sweeping things under the rug. It wasn't a revolution. It was a recalibration. And while his name wasn't always mentioned, the echo of his voice could be felt in rooms he'd never enter. He had become part of the architecture of truth, a hidden beam, a structural whisper. Necessary, but with legacy came danger. People tried to redefine his story, paint him as a radical, a martyr, a cautionary tale. Each label felt like a dilution. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted people to wake up, to act, to take what he'd begun and carry it farther. Because truth isn't a possession, it's a torch, one that must be passed, even when your own hands are still burning. He made peace with being misunderstood again, because the mission was never about being liked. It was about being useful. A young woman came to him with documents, evidence, the kind that could bring down a powerful name. Her hands shook as she placed the folder on his desk. "I don't know what to do," she said. He looked at her, not as a mentor, but as someone who had once stood exactly where she stood. And he said, "Tell the truth, then protect it, then teach someone else how." That moment felt full circle. Not an ending, but a continuation. He started traveling less, wrote more, taught in smaller circles. Not for attention, but for impact. Some lessons are too fragile for stages. They belong in whispered conversations, late-night phone calls, handwritten letters. He understood now that movements don't always need banners. Sometimes they need gardeners, people who tend to the soil after the cameras are gone. He became that, quietly, intentionally, the architect of a deeper kind of change. The threats never fully vanished, but they lost their sting because he had built a life rooted in something they couldn't touch: integrity. His reputation wasn't spotless, it was scarred and sacred. And people trusted him not because he had all the answers, but because he had asked the hardest questions and survived them. That kind of credibility can't be bought. It has to be earned. By fire, by loss, by relentless truth. He would sit on his porch sometimes and listen to recordings of his old speeches, not out of vanity, but to remember his own voice, to remind himself where he had come from, because even those who carry torches need light sometimes. And when the doubts crept in, as they always do, he'd go back to the beginning, to the hallway, to the decision, to the whisper that became a war cry. Then, one night, a knock on the door. A child, no more than 12, holding a crumpled notebook. "My mom said you'd tell the truth," the boy said. "I wrote something. Can you read it?" He took the notebook with trembling hands, and in that moment, he knew. The story had outlived him. The fire had found another spark, and that was enough. He watched the world try to forget again. Different crisis, different players, same silence. But this time, something was different. The silence didn't hold as long. People spoke up, organized, recorded, shared. They quoted his words without knowing they were his, and he smiled, not out of pride but relief, because culture had shifted, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The seeds had taken root. He started seeing patterns others missed, not just in systems, but in people. He could tell when someone was about to break their silence. There was a look, a tension behind the eyes, a tremor in their voice. He had lived in that tension so long it became familiar, and so he listened, gently, patiently, because sometimes what someone needs isn't advice, it's a safe place to unravel. A documentary was made. He didn't like it. Too polished, too simple. They made it a hero's tale, clean arc, triumphant ending. But the truth was messier. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who refused to lie and paid the price. He wanted the complexity to be honored, the cost, the loneliness, the daily war between faith and fatigue. But media doesn't like nuance, so he let it go. The story wasn't his anymore. He met others like him, wounded truth-tellers, some still bleeding, some scarred over. They didn't gather often, but when they did, it was sacred. No titles, no speeches, just stories, shared with the kind of honesty that only exists between those who have walked through fire barefoot. They laughed more than people expected, laughed at the absurdity, the irony, the divine comedy of telling the truth in a world built on lies. Sometimes he wondered what his life would have been if he stayed silent. Safer, maybe, more convenient, but emptier. And he would have had to face the mirror every day knowing he chose peace over principle. That thought haunted him more than any threat ever could. Because legacy isn't built in comfort, it's carved in conflict. And the mirror doesn't lie. He began mentoring from afar, quietly supporting those on the edge of a decision. He didn't tell them what to do. He simply asked, "What would you want your children to know about your silence?" That question hit different, because at the end of the day, we all live with our echoes. And the ones who chose truth, they sleep differently. Not easier, just cleaner. And then one morning, no different than any other, he stood by a window and felt peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he no longer carried it alone. Others had picked up the torch. The story had splintered into 1,000 voices. And the darkness, it wasn't gone, but it was shrinking. Slowly, faithfully, because someone, somewhere, had once decided to speak. I'm Oliver, and like you, I've been in rooms where silence screamed louder than truth. If this story stirred something in you, it's because you were meant to hear it, so don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, share this message, and follow Jesus boldly, because the world needs your voice. Stand for what's right, even when your knees shake. I'm with you in this, always.